Hi to anyone who is joining us. We will be starting in just a couple of minutes. We'll just see if anyone else would like to join us today. So give us a couple of minutes and then we will get rolling.
I don't mind, it's up to you.
Just give it another couple of seconds and then we will get rolling. Cool. Right, I'm happy to start if everyone else is. Fantastic. So welcome to Populate Social's podcast session. I hope everyone is keeping well and safe. I'm Kaylee and I work for Populate as their social media assistant. So for those who may not know, Populate is a results-driven, boundary-pushing, no-nonsense creative social agency based in the ever so sunny capital of Wales, Cardiff. We specialise in social and have experience with brands in retail, fashion, sport, e-commerce and FMCG. And more of our clients are asking us about podcast advertising. So who'd have thought it? Decades after video killed the radio star, it's almost unbelievable that the audio-only format would make a massive comeback, but it did, and in a brand new medium of podcasts. So podcasts are on the rise with around 13 million listeners in the UK now tuning in each week, which is a huge figure. So podcast listening numbers have increased by 42% globally since the start of COVID-19 crisis, and more people are discovering content via this medium. Unlike pushy and traditional advertising that consumers are just no longer trusting, podcasts allow brands to build more authentic client relationships and is one of the newest medias to be embraced by marketers. And as brands flock to wherever their audience are hanging out, we've been witnessing the rise of this medium as a powerful content marketing tool. But what exactly does the future of podcast advertising look like? And most importantly, are they worth incorporating into your marketing strategy? So for today's session, we've compiled a panel of absolute experts who are going to discuss some of the top benefits of podcast marketing and a few tips to get started. And I'll introduce that lovely lot in just a little second. But as ever, we'd love to hear from you. So if there are any questions, please pop them in the comments box for me on Zoom and I'll keep an eye on there. Any hints and tips, what's working for you, what's not working for you, but hopefully we'll answer a lot of questions as we go along. So let's dive straight into it and introduce our lovely panel. So first things first, we have our own Daniel Simmons, founder of social marketing agency Populate, and on to the best married couple in the podcasting game. We have Marina Lois, co-founder and director, and Steve Austin's podcast producer, trainer and consultant, and co-founder of Bengo Media, a podcast provider. So Steve, I think let's get started with you. You run a special podcast production and production consultancy, running podcasts across various platforms. So the power of podcasts is really that they're noticeably becoming really versatile and they're super powerful and informative in advertising strategy for many marketers and brands alike. Podcasts are certainly becoming a more prominent form of marketing, but what sort of role have you seen them playing, in the last couple of months, and where do you see them going in the next couple of years?
Thanks, Kaylee. I mean, for me, podcasts are a phenomenal relationship builder. They're not a sales device, but they are very much about kind of getting your company, your organization, brand kind of out there for people to get familiar with, to people to understand your level of expertise, to build trust with you. And the trust is built through the depth of that relationship. We talked about that phenomenal figure of 13 million people listening to podcasts every week. For me, the figure that blows my mind as somebody who used to kind of run a radio station and kind of make lots of different radio programs is that once somebody presses play at the start of an episode, 65% of those people that do that kind of get to the end of the episode. Whether that be a 20-minute, 30-minute, 40-minute, hour-long episode, on average, 65% of people get all the way to the end. So it's phenomenal depth of relationship as a one-to-one medium, and therefore I think it just provides a real opportunity for anybody looking to get into podcasting, to demonstrate kind of their expertise to try and kind of build some trust. It's a really fantastic platform in order to do that.
Fantastic. That's a really great answer. And I didn't know that figure myself, actually, about people getting all the way through. I can barely get through like 20 minutes of Netflix, but saying that, I listen to my morning podcast every day, and that's like routine. So that's,
we're all creatures of habit. And I think that's kind of what we see, is that people kind of just feel completely and utterly comfortable in kind of in it being me time, and just this is my space. And I know the podcasts that I like, and I'm going to press play on them, and that's kind of what we're seeing.
That's perfect. So I suppose, Dan, going off from that, if we take a more social-centric direction on those sort of points there, we know that monitoring the success of marketing activity is incredibly important for brands and fellow marketers. So what are the most important metrics to keep tabs on with podcasting?
Yeah. Good morning, everyone. I think obviously with podcasting, I think it depends on people's understanding of what their audience is and what they're trying to achieve with that podcast itself. I think obviously the go-to number for everybody generally is, how many listeners have I got? How many millions of plays are we getting every week or every day or whatever? And I think people can become blinded a little bit by just trying to get as many listeners as possible on their podcasts. And I think that's not necessarily the approach that's beneficial for brands or organizations, that are maybe into quite niche industries, or, and they've got smaller audiences perhaps. So I think for us, when we're kind of talking to people about that kind of thing, it's about them understanding, who is it they're really trying to engage with here? What is the aim of that particular podcast? Is it just a brand awareness thing, or maybe it's, around a particular topic or a particular campaign? If it is kind of campaign focused and parts of that campaign are about driving traffic or what have you, then great. Maybe, making sure that within the podcast there are key opportunities which give information about how people can access, off-site links or what have you, and whatnot, to get people onto perhaps their website. So I think it really comes down to people understanding, who their audience is and what they're trying to achieve with that particular podcast. And then obviously your metrics fall off the back of that.
Fantastic. Very, very great. Thank you. So Marina, I have a couple of questions for you. Welcome to the party. Let's get it. So you're the other co-founder and director for Bengo Media. And what's available in terms of anyone thinking of starting a podcast? And also, what are some of the key things to think about if you're thinking about starting a podcast?
So in terms of what's available, it's that lovely thing of how long's a piece of string. But you can do anything from just getting some help online with how to start a podcast. There's training sessions, there's consultancies, there's little how-to books, all the way up to someone being able to help you with the bits people don't really like editing. So if you want to do your own and then put all the editing over to someone else, that's fine. Right up to big, full-on, full-scale productions, which involve maybe actors or big name presenters, scripting. So again, almost going back to what Dan said, you really have to know what your podcast is about and who it's for, to know what kind of production you need to be putting together, which is actually one of the key things to think about. I couldn't agree with Dan more in terms of you need to know exactly who you're aiming to go for, because if you don't, then you'll just either be super excited with your results or dead disappointed, because you don't know who you're trying to target. So you need to know who you're going for, where you can find your listeners. So do they live in a particular online environment? Are they people from your database? Or are you going for a massive entertainment, juggernaut of a podcast, at which point, you need to kind of tell lots and lots of people that it's there. And again, as Dan said, you need to know how you're going to measure your success of the podcast. Have you got metrics in place to make sure that if someone picks up the phone and says, "Oh, I'm a new customer," are you actually saying, "How did you hear about us?" So you know that your podcast is delivering exactly what you need it to do. So all in the planning. That's the important thing. Make sure you know who you're targeting, where they are, and how you're going to measure your success.
Amazing, that's perfect. So going off that then, I suppose, Dan, noting that there is so much potential in one marketing medium, what role have podcasts played in building successful brand ad strategies, and what interesting trends have you been seeing over the last couple of months?
Yeah, I think And there's quite a few things here, really. I suppose, obviously, podcasting has become a medium that brands can use to advertise on themselves. So whether it's looking at other podcasts that maybe fit their audience, and for example, I know on Steve Bartlett's podcast, he's affiliated to Huel quite heavily, and he promotes that. And I think the people that listen to his podcast are busy people, probably in the main, and entrepreneurs or whatever. And I think, albeit he's got a huge audience now, that really fits with a brand like Huel, and I'm sure they've gained customers through that. And actually, just by affiliation to him, it will help grow their brand and kind of build that brand sort of ideals, I suppose. So there's all that's available now. Obviously, Spotify has its own kind of advertising platform that you can sell, which is self-serve, which is great as well, that people can advertise on. And I think then when you come down to actually the podcast itself as a medium for advertising a brand, there's lots of different ways that can be done. Whether it's people really resonate with that kind of behind the scenes, sort of very real sort of structure and like honest, I guess, approach to voicing about their business. And I think that's something that has really helped people understand who it is they're buying from potentially, and what it is that makes up that business. So, as a result of that, naturally it can become a really powerful marketing channel and an advertising platform for people. I think, as Steve's mentioned, and yourself, Kaylee, about some of the volumes of numbers are only growing, right? And I think, albeit podcasting is still quite a new phenomenon, and as a result, there's opportunity there to perhaps pick up audiences that you might not get in other areas. And I think, again, it's very similar to a conversation we've had with TikTok recently. There's probably a portion of people that just aren't on some of the other platforms, that don't, they're not watching YouTube, they're not on Facebook, they're not on Instagram, and they use podcasting as their form of like entertainment, or, that's their sort of, I guess, social platform that they use. And I think, there's probably people out there, then a percentage of people's audiences or brands' audiences that can be reached through the medium of podcasting, and as a result, there's opportunities there as well. So, yeah, I think that there's some really interesting things that, I guess, coincide with it, and obviously as well, like it's long form content in the main, and I think, and it's voice only, right, which is something that is a really fast growing sector again, whether that's through sort of your Amazon stuff like Alexa, or whether it is things like podcasting. It's something that brands are really starting to tune into now, and try and make the most of it, because it does work. I think it's clear for people to see that there's opportunity there. I think we've done some work with some brands in the past, whereby they've sponsored some very small podcasts. It was in the sports sector, and they've done they put some budget behind some of the fan-led podcasts, which only had 500 listeners a podcast, or it might have 1,000 listeners. And I think, but some of the signups they've seen off that is they're hugely motivated audiences, right? They're very bought into those particular people, they trust them, and as a result, there's some positive results that can be seen off the back of it.
I think if I can jump in there as well, actually, because that's exactly why numbers of downloads and figures can be really deceptive for the success of a podcast. The success of a podcast comes from the buy-in that you have from the listener. So, if you've got, say, 10 absolutely motivated listeners, most people might think that's a failure. But if 10 of those buy your Lamborghini, that's 10 Lamborghinis you just sold. So it's a case of what you're promoting and the quality of person that comes through the door. And podcasts are naturally self-selecting tools. So someone that's kind of pushed the play button on your podcast is already kind of interested and curious as to what you've got to say, and then it's your responsibility to keep them interested in what you've got to say. They've already said, "Oh, I'm interested in you," so it's almost for us to turn them off at that point. So yeah, numbers aren't the thing for podcasts in the sense of building your reputation. It's the quality of the person that clicks through and their engagement and their relationship with you.
The thing on that kind of just that resonates for me is that we worked with a data analysis kind of firm kind of a couple of years back, and we did the first episode, and the first episode got low three figures kind of as a download out, and I kind of just went and asked the question, kind of, how do you feel about that? He said, "Steve, if I got that many people reading one of our white papers, I would be over the moon, and so would my bosses." So kind of it's all about the perspectives.
That's brilliant. Yeah, just with those like 3-figure numbers, it is crazy to think that if you had that many, like you said, that many people reading your webpage or that many people in a room watching you work, what that scale would look like. And I think it's so easy to get swept up in those huge figures, isn't it? Of, oh, this is this many, this is this many. But I think that's a really great perspective to give people. Just tracking back ever so slightly, Dan, you mentioned a little bit about cost. Just in your previous answer. So I'd just like to go a little bit deeper into that with how much roughly a company's spending on podcast advertisement.
Yeah, I think obviously that varies, right? Depending on, it's a very political answer this, right? I think that there's, it depends on the size of that, you know, the opportunity really for them and how big the podcast is maybe that they want to, I guess, advertise on, or if there are, you know, the production of that podcast for people as well. It can vary, you know, in price, you know, whether you want to do it yourself and you maybe want some support with it, or maybe you want a full podcast production done externally. You know, there's varying, I guess, prices, you know, and opportunities and options available to people. I do think that, as I said, you know, there's those smaller podcasts that maybe have super highly motivated audiences where people just don't even realize that they can, the guys that run them don't even know they could charge for sponsorship. So probably there's some opportunity there to do something with them. And then you could go right up to the upper echelons where, you know, it will be like paying an influencer, and it will be, you know, well into the thousands of pounds to even have a slot on, you know, on their podcast. So one of the other things I think is interesting is like, maybe trying to integrate brands into it in a way which is non-invasive. So could it be done through sort of a quiz or like a sponsored section that was maybe just actually a little bit more relevant to the audience? And you know, there are some good examples out there of ways that people have done that, and it's not just like an advert that's kind of thrown into the middle of a podcast. It actually just becomes a segment that is actually engaging to the audience and you know, whatnot. There's you know, good examples of it on the radio. Things like Talk Sport have got, you know, Wix, and they do various things on there, and some of the kind of betting things they do as well. So I think, yeah, you know, from an advertiser perspective, there are self-serve ad platforms, like I said, for Spotify and stuff, which you can spend very little on, all the way through to some much more major spend levels, I guess.
There's a great podcast that Corn sponsor called Three Little Words, which John Bishop kind of presents, and it's incredible in terms of kind of Corn's on the cover art, but beyond kind of a mention in the podcast, the rest of it is kind of, you know, pretty much kind of the, you know, off the top of the head of John Bishop and the guests that he got. But one of the episodes within the series is a topic that kind of Corn has kind of said, we'd like you to talk about this. Same format, but it's an episode that belongs to Corn. So there are different models, kind of much as Dan was saying, about how you can potentially kind of work with podcasters out there.
So going off that then, Steve, I think, you know, there's, like you're saying, lots of different formats and things. Some brand owners and individuals are often put off by the risk of advertising with something that's completely new to them, which is completely natural, of course. But I feel like we can delve into that a little bit and just go into like how easy and affordable podcasts to produce.
Well, I mean, it's interesting. There were lots of kind of myths to bust about kind of, you know, how complex it was to kind of record podcasting. And then March the 23rd, 2020 happened. We all went into lockdown, and podcasts pretty much kind of looked like this, you know, in terms of, you know, it completely and utterly leveled the playing field in terms of how podcasts were produced. And I think the truth of the matter is, in terms of affordability, if you're starting out, actually, you know, a platform like Zoom, and then there are others which are kind of more specific to kind of record in higher quality audio out there. But ultimately, it's the same delivery method. Basically, you can kind of record everybody and, you know, get a really kind of high end product. The other thing kind of in terms of expense would be kind of just not doing what we're doing now, which is kind of just talking kind of directly into the laptop, but kind of investing in a USB microphone so that it catches you in good quality, and just trying to manage the sound kind of in there. Beyond that, you'd spend potentially some money on kind of a podcast host that will host all your files and kind of generate an RSS feed, which would then send out to Apple, Spotify, Amazon, etc., etc. But beyond that, your costs don't need to be enormous. I mean, I think kind of if you're equating cost with intellectual time and kind of and kind of, you know, trying to kind of equate that to the amount of time that you spend on it, then actually that does need a bit more thought, because I think actually our recommendation to new companies to work with is think about this as a project and actually build it out as a project. So do all the research at once, try and do the recordings within a block, the editing within a block, and then work out a release strategy that works for you and your organization and when your listeners are going to be thinking about it. If you do it kind of as it's a Thursday afternoon and it's, oh crikey, I've got to get a podcast out on Monday, then it becomes kind of quite a cumbersome part of thing, which can eat up time and resource basically. So I think if you're strategic about how you do it, you really don't need to spend an awful lot of money to make a really incredible impact in terms of the audiences that you're trying to reach.
Brilliant. So building that even further, I suppose, Marina, as we've heard, Bengo is a super interesting proposition, and you guys seem to be working with some really great businesses at the moment. Are there any specific examples or brands that you've worked with that you've got good results from that maybe we could get a little sneaky peek and intel into if people aren't already convinced that podcasting is the right way to go? It'd be great to hear what you've got to say.
I mean, obviously, I'm going to say there are, clearly, but yes, no, you know, there are, and I think I probably want to give you examples of probably companies that are at different ends of the spectrum, just to really kind of bring home the example that you don't have to be a massive company with a huge budget to get results. So I think one of the first people we ever worked with was a one-woman band. She was a wedding planner. Very local to us, and she wanted to build reputation, and she wanted to cut down on, you know, the number of proposals that she had to go and throw out to people before anyone would buy from her. And she did a podcast series which turned into 2 podcast series, which are still downloadable now, you know, years after she did them. And 2 things especially happened for her. I should also say she had no marketing spend, so she literally, it was all on her social that she built the following. And so she managed, you know, to, at one point very early on, she became a talking head for William and Kate's royal wedding on the BBC. So the BBC picked her up as a talking head. So that built her reputation up even more. And then, you know, she started getting email/phone calls from potential clients that literally, the phone calls went along the lines of, we actually want to book you. So she didn't even have to go through the hurdles of competing against other wedding planners or going through the, oh, I'm not sure, what do wedding planners do? I don't know if I need one. That work had already been taken care of by the podcast, because the people had got to know her already. They'd already said, that's who I want for my wedding. Or and she literally, the amount of work that it cut down on for her in finding clients was so she's a really tiny example of how it worked really well for her, and a great example of how she didn't need 100 people knocking on her door. She wouldn't have been able to manage it. She just needed a few each month, and off she went, which was great. And then the other one, we had a very nice, lovely company, massive healthcare company that came to us, and I think it's 2-3 years since they've done a podcast. They're over 170,000 downloads, and still going, and then it keeps going up each month. And they, anecdotally, what they've seen is, you know, people are picking up the phone that they never ever would have touched before, saying, oh, can I please speak to someone about this? The cautionary tale there is they weren't expecting that to happen, so they didn't have a process in place of how to deal with the queries that came in, which they rapidly then got, you know, they put it into place. But they're 2 very different examples. So there's a one-man band versus a big company. All comes down to who do you want to target and what you're going to do with them when they come through the door. And they both had really great successes.
And creating evergreen content, because in both of those cases, plus kind of we work with Welsh Government on their, since 2018, we've been working on a podcast series that's been talking about the curriculum for Wales, or the new curriculum for Wales. And actually, some of the first podcasts we made, which were a very big helicopter view of kind of what was coming, are still the best performing podcasts now, 3 years down the line, because, as I say, they give out those big kind of evergreen messages about it. And I think that's the thing to think about with podcasts, because I think a lot of people think, oh, I need to be topical, and I need to talk about the new trends and stuff like that. I don't think people use podcasts in that way, unless you're producing a topical news podcast or something that's specifically about that. People will stumble on your podcast in a year's time, 2 years time. So actually, what content can you provide that's evergreen, that will still resonate with people? Much as kind of, you know, the wedding planner example, at the end of the day, kind of the steps taken from you know, from the engagement through to the wedding night are exactly the same, whether they be kind of in 2018 through to kind of 2030 probably. So that is always critical and key as well.
Amazing. So I suppose, Eva, so just so we're covering all bases here, just like images and videos, you know, and sort of more traditional advertising, podcasts also need to be hosted somewhere. So what are the best podcast platforms, do you think? This is just an open question for anybody, really. What are the best podcast platforms that are currently out there for brands, do you think?
So in terms of hosting, by the way, Marina hasn't just walked out of your webinar. There's a thing. We just need to sort of thing out. This is the thing about being a husband and wife team. We're based at home, and you know,
all the clogs are turning.
All the clogs are turning at the same time. So yeah, so kind of like so if anybody's watching and thinking, that's unbelievable, someone just stormed out, that's not what happened. So with regards to kind of, you know, the platform hosts and stuff like that, I mean, you can host for free. You know, there's a company called Anchor, which is owned by Spotify, and that will basically be a brilliant way to kind of get your kind of podcast journey started, because it's no cost as opposed to low cost. But hosting is relatively kind of you know, for I would say kind of for the level of stats that you get, for the level of autonomy that you get, and the ability to be able to kind of add podcasts to your stable, then actually spending a relatively small amount of money, so about kind of about 20 quid a month on hosting, will probably serve you incredibly well. So there are really good platforms out there. Buzzsprout, Spreaker is the one that we use. There's platforms like Libsyn, which kind of have been around for many years. And I think a lot of people worry about, well, what do you mean that those companies host my files? Well, you know, we're used to having web hosts, and we feel completely confident in kind of, you know, people hosting our websites. And as much as anything else, if you do stumble on a podcast that's going to get 6-figure downloads, what you don't want is those, you know, is 100,000 people kind of drawing on kind of your on your broadband. So kind of you do want kind of those files hosted elsewhere as well. And I think the other major advantage with these hosts is that actually they all know, and they're all primed to kind of make it as simple as possible to get your podcast up on Apple Podcasts and Spotify and Google Podcasts and Amazon, which I think are probably the big four. Of those, for me, if you're not on Apple Podcasts, you don't have a podcast, because actually 80% of all the listen, or 70% of all the listening to podcasts in the world is done via an Apple platform of some sort or another. So Apple is huge, Spotify is huge. Then I would say that Google and Amazon are absolutely two horses to back, because they're Google and Amazon. Then there's the rest. Then there are multiple thousands of apps to kind of, you know, go for them, which will probably get you 0.01% of an audience. But actually, if you've got that, then you've probably got that podcast out there to as many people as possible. Plus also kind of just making sure that your podcast is visible on your website, having a kind of a /podcast section of your website, having each episode kind of just being able to kind of just view each episode on a single page, being able to play those episodes from that page, and also be able to tell your audience where else they can listen to it. All of this is so important about actually helping to distribute and get that message out there about where your podcast is.
Amazing. So let's have a look here. So for brands, we know, let's have a look here, that building trust is becoming even more challenging. Just going from that. So we know that people have got all these big podcasts in lots of big places. And then it's kind of the question of, why should I be doing it? Where's my trust in this? As we've highlighted, though, podcasts do allow brands to deliver content that is of value. And I think that's a really good kind of key point to home in about the trust there, as well as authentic results that have become a great tool in connecting with harder to reach audiences, which we covered a little bit before. And after all, trust does equate to more sales, if that is kind of your prime narrative there. So I suppose, again, open to everyone, how do brands achieve the fine art of delivering podcast content that's engaging but also delivers?
I'm happy to take that down.
Yeah, no, you go first.
I'll start by giving you another stat, which is 92% of us here in the UK listen to podcasts on our own. 79% of us are listening to podcasts on our smartphones. So actually, podcasting is this incredible one-to-one medium. I shout at people whenever kind of somebody opens up a podcast and say, "Hey, how you all doing? Hope you've all had a great," and it's just like, it's me, I'm walking the dog, I'm on my own here, kind of, this is me time. And I think there's a huge power in that. And I think in terms of engagement and in terms of building that trust and building that relationship, then playing on that and actually being benevolent with your expertise and kind of just making sure that you're not proprietorial about kind of, I've got good information, but I'm not telling you unless you pay me some money for it. I think if you're willing to share and willing to share, some of your knowledge, some of the bringing on people who and trust within, kind of your sphere, who can also share their knowledge as well. I think that's what builds trust. That's what builds this energy and kind of, and I think that's where kind of brands and companies that get that really start connecting with those audiences.
Amazing. So let's thinking so now we have our sort of content, if you like, structured out in our little imaginary scenario, if you like, for people listening. So Dan, we now know it's all well and good, creating a podcast, but from your perspective, what do you think that people, what we actually need to do to get people to listen to them?
Yeah, I think it's one of the major pitfalls, isn't it? And it's just not being able to get people to actually go on to your podcast. And I think, as Steve mentioned, there are some very basic things like adding it to your website, which people often miss. And I think whether that's, a landing page or putting it in the menu bar or having a pop-up that comes up when you've released a new episode, or, maybe you've got an email database that you haven't even told yet about the fact you've got a podcast. I think, you're marketing it in a way that you would market any other campaign, really. Look at the channels that you have available to yourself, your social platforms, your website, your email databases. Paid social is obviously a way that can be done, and depending on the audience will depend on obviously what platform maybe is suitable. So if you're more kind of niche and, let's say you're in the sort of the healthcare sector and you're trying to target doctors or nurses or what have you, and there are obviously certain platforms and groups and things that they engage with. I think you can look at other forms, like trying to get people that are involved in the community to share it. So maybe do some competitions or something in the podcast itself, right? If you share the episode to your Instagram stories and maybe tag a few friends or whatever, we'll give away X, Y, and Z as a little freebie or whatever to some people that have engaged with it. So I think there's lots of different forms of marketing that can be done here to push the podcast out there. I think, as Steve said, getting it on as many platforms as possible is obviously beneficial, because that will give you the biggest viewership or biggest listenership, I suppose. And then I think one thing for us that we find super helpful is if people film the podcast as well, creating some amazing snippets of that and seeding that on other platforms to sort of, I guess, whet the appetite of the audience is super helpful as well. And I think that's something that can be missed, and it's very simple. Even nowadays with Zoom and everything, if people are recording things, it's super easy to clip it up, brand it up very ever so slightly, and just throw out like a minute long clip or a 30-second thing. if there's some more risque things that are being said in the podcast that are going to pique the interest of a listener or some potential listener, then great. Let's do that. Let's use those things. Yeah, I think that there's tons of stuff obviously that can be super helpful for it, and I think there's opportunity out there for people, both physically as well. Physical events. There's little thing, maybe create some little flyers and put them on everyone's chair. If you've got a podcast and you've got a lot of people come to a conference, why not use that? And I guess the other thing is maybe doing it through your guests as well. If you've got guests on the podcast, making sure they're bought into the sharing of that podcast, maybe even leveraging certain guests, right, to get good people on your podcast that have got an audience that can help you grow it, especially in the earlier days, and build up. Number one, they probably have a bit of trust in because they've built an audience for themselves, that's obviously within your demographic that you're trying to target. And then obviously getting them to engage directly as part of being a guest. So, making sure you're tagging them in all the social posts, giving them assets to share, create a Dropbox folder with assets that they can share on their own social channels or to their own audiences through email and whatnot. There's such a ton of variety of things, that people can do to really help leverage their platform, I guess.
I suppose same question to both Steve and Marina there. How do we attract the right sort of audiences to listen to our podcast? I know Dan's covered a lot there, but from your point of view, you've given us a lot about, we have an idea, we found our niche, we've got our content, and now it's like, there's all these people. Who wants to listen to me, kind of thing? What would be your response to that?
I mean, for me, I think kind of there's two really good tangible examples that I think go a long way to answering that kind of in the podcast space. One is a podcast out there called Doing It for the Kids, which is a podcast by two self-employed people who have young families at home, and it's for self-employed people who have young families at home. I can't understand why that resonates, but it does. Anyway, what I love about that podcast is that it has a Facebook group that's got about 10,000 followers on it, and actually one feeds the other. So they'll ask a question on the podcast, they'll answer it, they'll then put that up and say, what did you think of the podcast and kind of some of the things we talked about it. Then there'd be a lot of discussion on it. They then would pick up on that on the next podcast. In the meantime, they will pick a subject that somebody else is chatting about amongst those 8,000 people on the Facebook group to be the next subject they talk about on the podcast. And on it goes, and on it goes. And it's such a fantastic way of kind of both generating marketing and kind of content for your podcast. The other example is a very local example here in Cardiff, which is Steph Ellis and Mike making the Socially Distant Sports Bar podcast. And one of the brilliant cheats that they did in terms of actually getting that podcast noticed was that they encouraged people to go and rate and review the podcast, but when they went to rate and review, have a guess who the mystery guitarist who plays our theme tune at the start of the podcast. Well, basically what you then get is people 5-star review because they love the podcast, fire and abuse at Mike Bobbins and everybody else on the podcast, and saying, oh, by the way, is the mystery guitarist Eric Clapton, is the mystery guitar. Anyway, needless to say, the amount of reviews that came up and the amount of ratings that went through the roof. Now, that's important because actually what that does is it makes that podcast get noticed by kind of the internal teams at Apple and so on and so forth. So it climbs up the charts, more people see it, more people listen to it, and so on and so forth. 1 million downloads later, those guys are doing tremendously well.
Gosh, that's fantastic. We've just got a little question in here, which I'll jump into. So I suppose the question is, what are some of the tools that can be used? So I suppose let's simplify that slightly. If there were 3 things which you say that you'd have to sort of get going after everything that we've spoken about today, what would you say those 3 things would be, Steve and Marina? Do you reckon?
A microphone, a laptop, and some free editing software. There you go.
Perfect. Is there any editing softwares that you'd recommend for people to start off with?
There's actually keeping it in the kind of free realm. Audacity is a really good one. It looks a bit clunky. It's probably like on par with 1988 Microsoft Office and Windows, but you'd recognize all the buttons from it. So that's nice and easy. It does completely what you need it to do. And then something that's called Studio One Plus, that's got a free version, and obviously up to things like paid versions. If your company has Adobe Creative Cloud, then Adobe Audition sits within that, so you might already have that within your corporate intranet, so you might have access to that already.
And there are some fantastic USB microphones that start at about 35-40 quid, so you really don't have to spend the earth to sound good as well. But I mean, I think kind of that for me is really important, and also trying to manage the sound of kind of your guests as well by making sure that they're wearing headphones and
Can I throw one other thing in there? There's a fourth thing you need, and that's a hosting company, a podcast hosting company. So there you go. That's the four things you kind of need: microphone, laptop, editing software, and a hosting company.
And a bit of daring do.
Yeah, brilliant idea. That'll do it.
And Kaylee, is it all right if I ask a question to Marie and Steve? I think obviously kind of what do you think sets apart, I guess, the quality of production between someone that perhaps is doing it themselves and it's a bit of a home movie sort of style production versus someone that is super slick, the sound quality is very good and the editing of that podcast is clearly done well and properly. What do you think are the things that set them apart, and how can people achieve that?
I think from a listener, and I say this from a listener point of view, because Steve, bless him, makes the podcast, I just get to critique them. So from a listener point of view, it really comes down to sound quality. I don't mind who makes the podcast, whether it's a one man woman band to a big production house. It's all about the sound quality, because no matter how you want to try and get away with it, we are putting somebody else's noise into our little ear holes. Like, you can't get any closer to me without an introduction, in that kind of so if the sound quality is awful, I'm just going to move on to something else, and I don't care who's recorded it. So the best thing you can do, anything you can do to get your sound quality up would be great. And again, that can be really inexpensive. If we're just on a laptop, just make sure you've got a microphone. If you're in a big room, draw the curtains, get lots of soft furnishings around. There are so many tales of really well-known radio presenters who over lockdown have been in an airing cupboard or on their bed under a duvet. So try and make your space as small and as softly furnished as possible, and you'd find a ridiculously brilliant way of doing some audio there. That's as good as a soundproof studio.
I mean, for me, I think actually doing so, I think kind of the thing that sets maybe some of those big totemic American podcasts apart from kind of somebody starting up right now is really understanding the concept of storytelling and how to kind of just really engage kind of and the tools you need to kind of allow somebody to lean forward and really kind of buy into what you're doing. I mean, there are techniques out there. There's Ken Adams' Story Spine, kind of, which if you go to YouTube, you can kind of, there are tricks and tools kind of out there. One person who I think is really well worth looking into is a guy called Jay Acunzo, Acunzo, who kind of basically does an awful lot of blogging on podcasting done by companies. So it's absolutely totally in this space. And some of the stuff that he does, both in kind of blogs, but also in his podcast, which is called 3 Clips, it tells you an awful lot of stuff about kind of how to unpack stories for a listener and the techniques to kind of get people listening in.
Amazing.
Nice, thank you.
So I suppose finally then, I know we've covered a little bit of this with some examples, but just to wrap us all up, and for everyone here as well, please chime in with whatever you feel is relevant. Why should brands be jumping on the podcast phenomenon, and what types of benefits could they ultimately see from doing so?
Yeah, I think I'm happy to kick off here. I think obviously it's not right for everybody. I think that's one thing to make clear. Like, make sure that it's right for yourselves, and make sure that you've got a clear storyline and a clear audience that you're trying to go after. And once you've kind of found that out, spend the time planning it and understanding what it is you're going to talk about over a period of time. Maybe sense check that with your audience if you've got one, and see if they've got any, as Steve said, maybe ask them what they want to hear about if you're going to put something out there, and maybe build your podcast around some inferences from them. But once you kind of make that commitment to do it, I think it's one of those things that, we've talked about it ourselves, maybe doing a podcast, and it's kind of never happened. We've got a microphone and it's just sat up, but nothing's ever happened with it. So I think it's one of those things that, once you decide, I think, get it done and put it out there and learn from it. And then obviously as it grows, and hopefully you kind of improve things over time, and work with some experts if you can, to sort of get some insight. And, things like this are obviously beneficial for that, understanding maybe some of the pitfalls and some of the key things that you can implement to get the most out of it. And then, hopefully, it's successful for you, and keep thinking, keep iterating, and seeing if you can see what improvements you can make over time.
I think following up from what Dan just said, podcast audience is actually remarkably forgiving and loyal if you're honest with them. So if you have the capacity to do a podcast, make sure you're doing it in your true voice, but you're letting your kind of personality come through. Especially for a corporate podcast, this is really difficult to get through to kind of big companies, that you have to let your presenters and your guests just talk like human beings, because then they connect with the audience. So you might have to twitch a little bit and sit on your hands, and not make sure that everything's scripted and every answer is read off and approved by the board. You have to just trust the people in the room, that they know what they're talking about, and they can use their own language, their own anecdotes, because your audience then will relate to them, and that's how you build trust. And then they'll start throwing suggestions in as well. So that for me is the key thing about a podcast, is authenticity. You can't be someone that you're not, because you'll last for about 10 minutes, I reckon, trying to pretend to be someone that you're not, and then you'll slip back into who you are in the first place. So just be who you are, be really calm, and people really will respond to that, because it's such a personal one-to-one conversation.
Two things from me. One, picking up on what Dan was saying about taking the plunge. Everybody's 25th podcast is better than their 12th podcast, which is better than their 6th podcast, which is better than their first one. We all start and we learn from what we do. So the sooner you kind of press publish on that first podcast, the sooner you learn and how to become an accomplished podcaster. And you can only do that through doing the 8 miles of actually doing the thing.
Can I jump before you go on to your second one?
Okay.
Just literally on that. Your latest podcast will be the first one people hear as well. So they'll get the best of you anyway. Exactly. So podcasts are published in reverse order. So no one's going to start from number one. So the best you've got to offer is the one that's actually the first one they'll come across. So yeah, just get going with it and make as many as you can.
And one final thing, very, very quick thing, for a brand, why you should be thinking about podcasting. It's the only way you will be able to reach that potential customer without having a screen in front of them. So you don't need their attention for a blog or for a video or whatever. They can be walking the dog. They can be in their own thoughts, and literally it's just a conversation between you and them, and that is so powerful.
Well, I, for one, am feeling very inspired from today's chat. I feel like I want to grab my microphone myself and just get recording. Watch this space. No, but I'm kidding. But of course, for anyone that this has resonated with today, feel free to get in contact with Steve and Marina. You can find them on LinkedIn, also on Instagram as well. But we really hope that this has resonated with you. We've packed in a lot to this little chat today. So thank you very much, Dan, and thank you very much, Steve and Marina from Bengo, and hopefully we'll catch you sometime soon on another fantastic webinar. And thanks again, everyone, for joining and giving us the time of day to have a little chat with you about podcasting.
Nice one. Thanks, guys.
Thank you. Have a good day.
Thank you.
Bye.